My flight from Lima to Cusco was at 9:30 a.m. Cusco is the gateway to Machu Picchu, and Lima is the main international airport of Peru, so this route has more than 30 direct flights per day. I couldn't tell which line was for which gate. A large Japanese tour group was to my left. A cluster of German hikers were to my right. Airports exist in a curious in-between space. A microcosm of humanity gathers, united only by the desire to be elsewhere. There's an undercurrent of anxiety and excitement as some bid farewell to the familiar, while others prepare to embrace the unknown. I found a free seat not too far from my gate and sat down next to a woman reading a book. She had the book open and was simultaneously translating with her phone. I asked what she was reading. She showed me the book cover and replied, 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. She was reading the novel in its original Spanish version, but she didn't understand Spanish. That explained the translator. What an admirable dedication to the text. I hope she makes it to the end. I gave up 3 times before finally finishing on the 4th try, and I was reading the English version. I asked how she liked the story so far. She replied it was difficult to follow. The story is a sprawling epic that chronicles the history of a family over 7 generations, where many characters have the same name. I think most people struggle with this novel. The trick is to stop trying to keep track of who's who and enjoy the spectacular writing. The woman was traveling with her husband. They were from Romania, a country I'd very much like to visit. I asked about the capital, Bucharest, which I heard was very beautiful, but they were from Transylvania and knew more about the Romanian countryside than the cities. They were on their way to Cusco to hike the Incan Trail, which is a 4-day trek through the mountains. They hoped the high altitude wouldn't affect them too much since they were setting out as soon as they arrived. I felt the altitude as soon as I arrived in Cusco. The hills were densely populated with bare brick houses, reminiscent of the comunas in Medellin and the favelas in Brazil. Apparently, leaving the brick houses unfinished was a clever way to dodge property taxes. Once painted, the house was complete and subject to taxation. If left unpainted, the owner could avoid paying taxes forever. I booked a room in a guest house near the San Blas neighborhood, about a 15-minute walk from the central plaza. I noticed the building was painted. The owner was a vivacious Peruvian woman. She did the guest house admin and looked after the family home. Her husband was from Chile. He did the cleaning and repairs of the guest house. My bedroom had 2 twin beds. I used my extra bed as a long table where I kept my clothes and electronics. I had a private bathroom where you had to turn the shower faucet a few centimeters to the left for hot water. Turning it all the way to the end gave cold water. Showers in Latin America can be rather sensitive creatures. The guest house felt enormous, with 4 floors, a living room, a full kitchen with shared dining area, and an upstairs terrace with a panoramic view of the mountains. Cusco is one of the oldest cities in all of the Americas, over 3,000 years old. The cobblestone streets were narrow and steep, but it didn't stop taxis and vans from flying through them at an alarming speed. Shops, cafes, restaurants, and hotels were abundant, as well as street sellers trying to entice tourists with massages, alpaca scarves, walking tours, and authentic Peruvian 5-course meals. I stumbled through the alleyways, dizzy, disoriented, and gasping for breath from the high altitude. Cusco was over 11,000 feet above sea level, and my lungs could feel it. The Plaza de Armas was stunning. A cathedral dominated one side, while an equally impressive church stood across on the other side. The perimeter was lined with long, shady arcades. There were benches in the middle of the plaza, but you were a target for street sellers if you sat down, and the sun was much too strong. I stopped in the San Blas market to buy groceries and was shocked to see it not only had typical Peruvian food stalls, but also a few vegan food stalls serving falafel wraps and quinoa burgers. I noticed the vegan dishes cost 3 times the price of the Peruvian dishes, since their primary customers were Western tourists. It was a 10-minute walk from the market to my guest house. I had to stop twice because I couldn't breathe. The next day wasn't much better. I was out of breath just from making breakfast. I felt dizzy even while sitting down. I tried chewing coca leaves, a local remedy for altitude sickness, but I didn't feel any different. Cocaine comes from coca leaves, but chewing the leaf and snorting the chemically processed powder are 2 completely different things. A young American woman named Lauren gave me some altitude medicine, and it helped me feel close enough to normal. Lauren was from Texas and lived in Hawaii, working as a high school teacher. She was also a yoga instructor, a dog walker, and a barista. With these 4 jobs, she was able to cover her living expenses and save a little bit of money every month. She seemed to be having a wonderful vacation, going on different hike every day. She showed me a colorful stack of alpaca scarves she purchased that week. She wasn't sure when she'd wear them, since she lived on a tropical island. Later that evening, a sweet German woman named Lina offered me a cup of hot chocolate. She just returned from the Amazons and brought back pure chocolate powder. I thanked her and sipped my hot drink. It tasted comparable to a flat white. Pure chocolate isn't sweet at all. It's actually bitter and earthy, like roasted nuts or coffee. Chocolate originated in South America. Ancient civilizations consumed it as a drink, adding vanilla and chili peppers. The Spanish conquistadors introduced chocolate to Europe in the 16th century, and sugar was added over time. Lena said in Germany, a bag of hot chocolate powder would be more sugar than chocolate and 5 times the price. Lena was an entrepreneur. A few years ago, she started an alpaca clothing business with her best friend, who was Peruvian. After seeing some traction, she decided to quit her job and work on her business full-time. Her best friend oversaw the business side in Germany while she worked with suppliers in Peru and did some traveling of her own. She laughed and said it was funny how the Peruvian person was in Germany and the German person was in Peru. Even though there were many alpaca clothing brands in Germany, she and her business partner managed to differentiate their product from the rest. She confessed, instead of shipping the inventory to Germany, which cost over $100,000, she was bringing it back from Peru through checked luggage on commercial flights. I wondered at the legality of this, but didn't ask questions. It was refreshing to see someone energized and passionate about work. I've definitely met more people who would rather work less hours instead of more. The next day, I met Eric, a young Brazilian-Canadian man who was spending a few weeks in Cusco before heading back to Medellin. He previously worked in farming, which he referred to as the most thankless job in the world. He taught himself software engineering and realized he made 10 times the money in half the time than he would as a farmer. Then he started a geothermal company with his sister. Now he was teaching English online while traveling in Latin America. There seemed to be a huge gap between the geothermal startup and teaching English online, but I didn't want to pry. He seemed to answer my questions with a hint of resignation. I changed the subject and told Eric I was heading to Argentina after Peru. He promptly made a face and said he didn't like Argentina because of the socialist government. Eric despised the Canadian healthcare system, saying he had a horrific experience when his mother was diagnosed with cancer. In his words, he said, "When there's only one option, and it's a bad option, it's a catastrophe." In contrast, he showed great enthusiasm for Nicaragua. I asked why, since I've definitely heard better things about Argentina than Nicaragua. Eric replied, "Because it's cheap." I asked, "Is that all?" He said, That's all that matters to me. Since he was also Brazilian, I asked if he recommended any beach towns in Brazil. He suggested Florianopolis, a place I've never heard of. I wrote it down and hoped I spelled it right. The next day, I met Sharon, a 27-year-old American woman who just finished her English teaching certification and got a job at an institute in Cusco. She was in love with the city and eager to explore the rest of South America. That night for dinner, I bought Peruvian roast chicken from the restaurant around the corner and had it with leftover quinoa and stir-fried vegetables. The difference between Peruvian roast chicken and regular roast chicken is the marinade, which is made of garlic, soy sauce, cumin, vinegar, paprika, and other spices. Sharon joined me in the kitchen for dinner with a glass of red wine and a bowl of cold cuts, pickles, olives, and cheese. Cold cuts were her favorite food. She wrapped a slice of bologna around a pickle and devoured it with relish, as she lamented her mother's descent into alcoholism in the last few years. It started when Sharon's father retired. Before, he'd come home from work and have a beer with dinner, and Sharon's mother would have a glass of wine, maybe a second drink after dinner when they'd go to bed. Once retired, her father began having a beer with lunch, continued drinking throughout the afternoon and into the evening, and her mother would do the same. After a few months, he realized this habit had gotten out of control and cribbed his alcohol intake back to pre-retirement levels, but his wife did not. Sharon said her mother would often consume 2 bottles of wine in one day, and she was a mean drunk, yelling all kinds of verbal abuse at Sharon, sometimes even kicking the family dog. She shrugged and said she accepted her mother the way she was. Her relationship with her younger brother was better, but also had its tumultuous moments. She recounted the time he threw a full can of beer at her face during a family dinner. She was lucky. All she had was a nasty bruise around her left eye where you could see the outline of the beer can rim. She reported her brother to the police. He spent the night in jail. They didn't speak for a few months, and now they were on decent enough terms. Since Sharon had been living in Cusco for a few months, she had many recommendations for bars, restaurants, and cafes, as well as a few warnings. I felt safe walking in Cusco, although I still took the usual precautions of keeping my phone and money in a belt under my clothes. I was alarmed when she told me about a popular nightclub where a man can bribe the bartender to drug a girl he was interested in. She also told me of an instance where 2 tourists were drugged in a coffee shop at 3 in the afternoon. It didn't stop me from going out to cafes for a flat white, but sometimes the anecdote would cross my mind. A few days later, I met Max, a handsome young German man who made a memorable first impression. Within the first 10 minutes of meeting, he said the words gang rape, semen, and Nazis. To summarize, Max stated that statistically, immigrants were the main offenders of violent crime in Germany, especially sexual crimes against women. There was a recent case of a 10-year-old girl who was gang raped. Semen from 10 different men, and I assumed he meant immigrant men, were found inside her. I know very little about Europe. I've never been to Germany, but I have met many Germans in my travels, and they never spoke about their country in this way, especially not during the first conversation with a complete stranger. The subject of Nazis came up when I mentioned altitude sickness. Max said Hitler used to have his soldiers exercise in underground tunnels with the air sucked out. Supposedly, this helped them increase lung capacity and endurance. Max's face and neck were peeling. He recently went on a 5-hour hike under the formidable Peruvian sun without a hat or sunscreen, and his fair skin was suffering the consequences. He looked confused when I started preparing ingredients for dinner. He asked if I knew I could outsource my meals. I chuckled. Was he really asking if I was familiar with the concept of food delivery? I replied, I enjoyed cooking my meals. He responded, He did as well and even had a food blog. This 26-year-old was a Renaissance man. He was a psychologist, a business consultant, a professional photographer, an English teacher, and he was building an app. He proudly declared he worked 14-hour days. Max was staying in Peru for a few more weeks, then returning to Medellin, where he lived before. He had a nice apartment and a young Colombian woman waiting for him. He smiled and said she was faithful to him while he was away, but he was not faithful to her. He mentioned they'd only been dating for a month, and it was too early for him to call it a serious relationship. Max smiled and murmured, "I'm not as romantic as I used to be." Max only traveled to countries with traditional gender roles, and he had absolutely no interest in German women. I asked if he was concerned about safety in Medellin since foreign men tend to be targets for getting drugged and robbed on dates. Max was confident this would never happen to him because he only met local women during the day, in parks or museums. The ones interested in drugging eager Western men wouldn't waste their time on a date like that. He got up from his chair to throw something away and shook his head at the kitchen trash containers. There were only two options, organic and inorganic. Germany had 5 options: paper, plastic, glass, organic, and everything else. He must miss Germany very much. The orderliness, the punctuality, the meticulously compartmentalized trash cans. But for Max, his country was a lost cause. He said, with contempt in his voice, that a person with a master's degree couldn't afford to buy a home. The immigration policies of his country were a disaster. The government favored immigrants more than its own native citizens. I'm glad Max found sanctuary in Medellin, where his euros could stretch as far and wide as his masculinity. Colombia seemed to attract many frustrated Western men, both young and old. I hope they find happiness there and treat the women they meet with love and respect. I overheard him talking with another guest about a fascinating study. It claimed if a person was stranded on 2 different remote islands where one was inhabited by believers in God and the other was inhabited by non-believers, the chances of survival were much higher on the island of believers. How on earth could this study be proved? I wondered if Max was familiar with the Salem witch trials, where strong believers in God made accusations of witchcraft with no proof, leading to the execution of innocent people. I didn't join the conversation. There was an undercurrent of anger in the way this handsome young man spoke. It seemed to me he had something to prove and was eager to engage in conflict. When I encounter anyone with strong opinions like these, I find it wiser to listen and process what they say in private. They usually have a lot to say on subjects I don't know much about in the first place. I went back to my room to read for a few hours. Cusco was cold in the evenings. My cozy bed was inviting. I was rereading one of my favorite books, The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy. The story follows Esther and Rahel, twins in Kerala, India, whose childhood innocence is shattered by forbidden love and a family tragedy. The story jumps between their past and present as they grapple with the lingering effects of the trauma and try to reconnect as adults. Later in the week, I met a Chinese woman named April, who just returned from a day tour at Humantai Lake. She quit her job in Canada to travel for a few months. She was what I'd call an aggressive traveler who packs every day with tours, activities, and sightseeing. April just took a 15-hour bus from Chile to Cusco, immediately booked a tour the day after, and was doing the 4-day Incan Trail hike the following day. I understood she wanted to make the most out of these precious months between jobs, but it sounded more like a boot camp than a vacation. She lost her phone on a boat ride on Lake Titicaca. At first, she was distraught, but a girl in her tour group recalled the time she had her phone stolen on a train in India. The experience changed her relationship with her phone and reminded her that before these gadgets existed, people still traveled. April calmed down, got a new phone in the next town, and everything was fine. She had a boyfriend she loved very much. He was waiting for her back in Canada while taking care of their Cocker Spaniel. She said he had a wonderful personality that was compatible with hers. However, she wasn't sure if he was the one because he didn't want children. April's father died when she was a child. Her mother raised her and her brother by working as a fruit seller at the local market in China. Once they were grown, April went to university in Malaysia, then got a job in Canada. Her brother stayed in their hometown to run the fruit stall. She said his disappointments with life spilled out whenever he was drunk, much to the distress of their mother, who couldn't fathom he may have had some unrealized dreams. April said when she was younger, her mother made it clear that she was expected to get married and have children like any other woman. Now that April was in her early 30s and in a loving relationship with a good man who didn't want children, her mother's expectations have adjusted. Now, she tells April it isn't worth losing a good man at her age, and perhaps having children isn't necessary after all. I wonder where these people are now, and how their lives have been shaped by their beliefs. You never know who you'll meet next in your travels. Find out about my week in Lima, Peru's capital city, in this video, where I have a night out with my handsome host, explore the local gastronomy, and have an interesting conversation with a Venezuelan taxi driver.